Hello and welcome to episode 11 of the Money Side Up podcast, the personal finance podcast covering all things money for Australians all over the world, from Australian property to setting up wills, your estate planning as an expat abroad, buying property back home, even moving back to Australia and contributing to super. We've got it all covered. This is the podcast where each month we interview an expert on a different topic, covering, again, all areas of personal finance. I'm Jarrad Brown, based here in Singapore, and joining me today is my esteemed colleague, Will Cant in New South Wales. G'day, Will.
G'day, everyone, and thanks for tuning in always. Just want to say, as we always do, these podcasts are for informational purposes only, educational purposes only. It is all general advice. Obviously, if you do want to get any specific tailored advice, please reach out to myself, reach out to Jarrad. Don't race off the back of this podcast, make any crazy decisions with your finances. Definitely get some specific help for your situation. Now, Jarrad, a few things I want to touch base with you before we get into the interview today. Obviously, you're based in Singapore. I'm based here in Australia. Cost of living, it's been the headline for every second news article, it seems, for the past 6 months here in Australia. The ACCC looking into Woolworths, looking into Coles over and over again about price gouging, and inflation's been so high that people are really, really feeling the pinch here in Australia. And it's all we seem to be talking about here in Australia. It's such a common issue for so many people. But, what are you seeing, both in Singapore, but globally in the rest of the world when it comes to the cost of living crisis?
Yeah, look, I think it's definitely a big one. I mean, it's kind of hurting everyone everywhere. There's not really any escaping it. I mean, I think the one big difference that, perhaps expats, at least in Singapore, have, and even the Middle East, where personal income tax rates are a lot lower, often and not always, be careful how I word this one, but, in some cases we'll have a bit more, room to be more flexible. I mean, if you're working in Australia and you're earning 300, 400, 500 a year, and okay, first world problems here, but, you're now paying 47 to 49 cents in the dollar in tax, depending on obviously the financial year, and what your expenses look like. Well, that only leaves basically half your income to actually adjust. So if costs are rising, it doesn't leave you a great deal of room to move. Whereas you compare that to, say, Singapore, where your net effective tax rate might be 15, 16%, or, other countries around the world where it might be nothing, or it might be 3, 4, 5%. I think there's a lot more kind of, wiggle room there, or time to kind of sit down, review your budget, and hopefully make some smart changes. But we're definitely not escaping it here in Singapore. We copped the rental increase last year. Over the last 18 to 24 months, rather. Feels very recent, but it started a little while ago, where most people, copped a 30 to sort of 85% increase in their rent, which wasn't cheap to begin with. But that's been an astronomical rise, which has definitely hit. But I understand, back in Australia, we're kind of seeing the same thing with vacancy rates being so low.
Yeah, but I think the key thing, you touched on it really briefly there, is reviewing your budget. Like people, these things are out of your control, but what is in your control is looking at your expenses, looking at your income, looking at where your money is going. But I find that when people do it, they're never realistic. People will write down a budget or review their budget on their goals and what they're aspiring to, as opposed to, what is much more realistic. People will say, we're only going to spend 10 grand on the holiday this year, when realistically you'll probably spend 15 or 20, whatever it is, as that actual number. And that's what I always say to people, is write down the specific number, be realistic what you want to spend. You'd rather, overshoot than undershoot, especially with things like this, and especially with the cost of things probably continuing to go up, as time goes on as well. But I suppose an interesting point here too, you touched on housing. And I suppose this might be a conversation for another day, given the way the government changes things and what will happen. That there's been a bit of recent news about the Labor government looking into negative gearing. A lot of people get benefits from negative gearing. A lot of expats still use the negative gearing benefit, given the fact that property in Australia will still be taxable here in Australia. Do you have any crystal ball, guesses what's going to happen there, or I suppose how to plan for anything that could happen there?
Yeah, look, dust off the crystal ball, hey? Look, as an expat and as a fairly long-term expat, I often sort of look at these headlines and think, it's kind of the same thing year on year. It's landlords, business owners, and expats are kind of viewed as the piggy banks of Australia. And rightly or wrongly, yes, there's a bit of inequality, I guess, when it comes to wealth distribution in many, many countries. But these are kind of the three groups of people that are pretty consistently, viewed, I guess, as the way to raise revenue, whether it's increasing land tax or it's changing negative gearing or it's payroll tax or it's some other revenue raising tool that's usually targeted at one of these three, or it's expats who are just not on the electoral roll anyway. So yeah, that's a pretty easy place to make some changes like we saw with the main residence exemption. But we can have that conversation another day. Getting to your actual question, look, negative gearing is a nice perk when it comes to investing in property in Australia. But to be honest, if that's the only reason you're investing in property in Australia, you're probably doing it wrong. It might make the cash flow a little easier to manage. It might mean you can spend a little bit more because of what that sort of out-of-pocket expense looks like, given where interest rates are sitting. But yeah, to be honest, if they did make that change and remove negative gearing tomorrow, if you would need to liquidate your portfolio, as I said, in my view, you're probably doing it wrong. And that's probably something that you need to run the numbers on and just make sure that it still makes, financial sense for you.
Yeah, property is such a large asset that you purchased. If you go and buy some shares, you can put $100 in, whereas you can't really just put $100 into a property. You put it in 500,000, 800,000, a million, whatever the value is. It's such a large decision. It's such a large asset that you're purchasing. So it's so important to get it right and to mitigate your risk wherever possible. And I think that's a great sentence you touched on there. If it doesn't make sense without the negative gearing, it probably doesn't make sense at all. Negative gearing is yes, a benefit, a feature that you can get with property investing, but is not the be all and the end all. It's not why you should go into buying that asset. There are definitely much more important reasons, like the capital growth, of that asset, for instance. It really should be directing that decision.
Yeah, most definitely. And I mean, I think, like anything, it needs to really stand on its own 2 feet without those tax benefits, to be honest. I mean, it's a little bit like investing in shares with franking credits. Again, if that's the only reason you're doing it, or, margin lending. I mean, it's a little bit like, setting $100 a light just to claim the 47-cent tax deduction. Doesn't make a lot of sense when you put it like that. Doesn't make a lot of sense in property either.
Look, we've got a pretty interesting interview today, going back to Singapore, to your hometown, home country, interviewing some immigration specialists. Do you want to give us the into that and what this interview is going to be about?
Yeah, certainly will. Look, Singapore, obviously home for me for many years now. This is year 12 at the time of recording and releasing this podcast. Hopefully we'll be here for quite a number of years yet. Thoroughly enjoy living here. But like everywhere, and like we've kind of already touched on, life is definitely getting more expensive. But we've also had a number of changes here. We've now got this thing called the One Pass here in Singapore, which is open to some Australian expats. So we're going to tackle a lot with the girls from Voyage Consultants today, who are the immigration specialists here for businesses and individuals. So plenty to unpack. How do you apply for EPs? Should you buy property here? What does it look like to become a permanent resident? What does it mean for your kids? How do you bring your spouse over? We've got plenty to dive into. So if you're happy to, Will, we might cross straight over to the interview and dive into the conversation with the girls.
Yeah, without further ado, let's do it.
Well, thank you very much for staying tuned with us on this podcast today. We are absolutely delighted to have Zoe and Canns of Voyage Consultants joining us today. Many of our listeners, many of our community are right here in Singapore, and we are forever asked the question about applying for permanent residency. How do I do it? Is it worth it? We've seen changes which we'll dive into on dependent passes, which impacted a lot of Australian expats right here in Singapore. We've now got this thing called a One Pass. What on earth is that? Should I get one? What does it mean? There is just so much to unpack in this space. We hear far too many rumours, many of which are untrue. So really delighted to have the girls share their expertise and time with us today. So first and foremost, ladies, thank you for your time. Say hello to our audience and maybe tell us a bit about yourselves.
Hello, hi. We are from Voyage Consultants, and we are your immigration specialists over here. We specialize in assisting people with applying for work passes. At the same time, we also assist with application for dependent passes, PRs, and citizenship. Whichever that you need, we will be here to help.
Fantastic. Well, yes, look, really appreciate that introduction. It is such a detailed space. We have plenty to dive into. So enough of my rambling. We'll dive straight into the questions. I guess let's start with, in some ways the biggest one first. I've been in Singapore 12 years now, thoroughly enjoy living here, and no plans to go anytime soon. So long may my right to stay here continue to be granted. But I guess as a starting point, maybe you could just share a bit with us from your expertise, the conversations you're having, why Singapore remains such a desirable place, not just for Australian expats, but for people in general.
I think most people actually would know that Singapore, there is a lot of incredible business and investment opportunities. And most of the people in Singapore, we are quite highly educated and motivated. So yeah, and in Singapore, the tax rate is pretty low depending on the level of income. So it could be 0 to 20%. Normally it's a tier system. So it's relatively low compared to other countries. We all know that Singapore is quite safe to come to. You can basically walk on the streets at 3 in the morning and you will be absolutely safe. Yeah. Yeah, or some typical examples would be like if you were to leave your handphone on the table and walk away and you come back, it will still be there for sure. Yeah. And also in Singapore, basically the educational system is top-notch around the world, and especially NUS University, National University of Singapore is ranked as one of the top 10 universities around the world. So basically in the rankings with Harvard and MIT as well. So these are like a few of the main reasons that Singapore is an attractive place to come to. Besides being multiracial and multicultural, you will find a mosque next to a Chinese temple or a Hindu temple next to a Chinese temple as such. Yeah. So these are the some of the benefits of Singapore.
Fantastic. Makes a lot of sense. And I think your comment around the, leaving the handphone on the table is a good one. And I mean, I certainly find a bit of a dangerous trap as well. You go back to Australia and leave your handphone on the table, you turn around and, not to disparage my home country, but good chance it won't be there when you turn around. Or at the very least, some kid will have picked it up and thrown it somewhere. But yeah, certainly lovely aspects to life in Singapore. I guess for Australian expats, generally speaking, maybe you could talk us through some of the, sort of big expenses, I guess, to life in Singapore for expats. We hear a bit about rent. We always sort of see these random headlines around cars being very expensive here. But what are some of the big expenses that you're talking through with people when they're thinking about moving here?
Okay, so I'll also go a little bit personal because I was living overseas for a number of years. I was in the Middle East for more than 10 years. So before coming back to Singapore, I was concerned because everyone was saying it's like things are so expensive, rentals are expensive, cars are expensive. But when I moved back home, things are actually more manageable than I expected via the rumors. Yeah, so for instance, if you were to get a second-hand car and you get a loan, it might cost you maybe 600 to 1,000 per month to pay for the car, as compared to the rumors that you have to spend like $3,000 a month for the car. So it depends on what kind you're getting. So obviously, if you're getting a brand new car, that might cost a little bit more. Transportation system is very cheap in Singapore. You can take a train or FRT as you know it, and to get you from one end of Singapore to the other, and it costs you less than $3 train. And for instance, we have hawker stores here where you get your daily meals. It can cost between like $3.50 to $5 for a meal. So I remember going to Australia, if I were to get like a simple fried rice, it would cost me maybe $12 for one. Yeah, whereas in Singapore, you can easily get one for $4, $5.
I think the key thing there is that some things are more expensive, but some things can be a lot cheaper, like anywhere that you go in the world. So if you're an Australian expat and you were considering setting up a business in Singapore, what are the main steps you would need to take or to consider to make that move?
So to set up a business in Singapore, right, definitely there are a few key things to consider. Firstly, it depends on which industry you are going to have your business set up in. So there's something that is called a pay-up capital, which is the same as setting up a business anywhere around the world. And in Singapore, it just has to make sense. So example, if you're going to do an online business, your operational cost is going to be very low. So you can have a pay-up capital of like $5,000. That's going to manage all your operational costs. But let's say if you're going to set up a proper like a bar and restaurant, definitely you will need at least like $200,000 to pay for rental, to buy equipment, to get employees for the first couple of months. So this is one of the key things to consider, the industry and the funds that you are able to contribute to at the start to get the business running. Then a few other things that is also interesting, that in Singapore, there are also government grants or tax relief for new businesses. So for instance, some of the government grants are available there's something called Energy Efficiency Fund. So if you're kind of in the renewable energy or green sector, that's something that you could possibly get grants on. Then there's also like business improvement funds. There's something that you can use for digital marketing as well. There's some tax relief for new businesses. For instance, the first year, if your profit is less than 100,000, it's complete tax exemption. Then, example, the next 200,000 of profit for the first year is only 50% tax that's chargeable. So these are also some of the benefits to help people who are newly coming to Singapore to set up their business. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the government grants is such an important piece. Like, so many people don't realize that these things are available, and then think it might be such a barrier to them to make the move. But then when they realize all these tax reliefs or grants or help that's available to them, it can definitely make it a lot easier. What if you, let's say, weren't, a business owner and you were moving to Singapore? I know there's lots of different options that you've got. You've got the employment pass, the S pass, the one pass. What's the differences between all of those?
Yeah, so I know there's so many different passes. It can be confusing, like what am I eligible for? What should I apply for? So we'll just touch across the main passes that most of the expats will apply for. So the first one would be called the S pass. This is for skilled workers. That's why the S in front of it. So this is basically for skilled industries such as technicians or associate professionals. But for S pass, there is a little challenge there because the salary to be able to get an S pass is lower, but the company who is employing the person will need to have a local quota or local headcount. So what this means is that the company needs to have, example, if you are in the services sector, the company needs to have 9 local employees before employing 1 foreigner. So this is one of the challenge that some companies might face. So this is recommended if you are joining a MNC who already have a lot of employees. So the next most common pass is called the EP, which is the employment pass. So this is generally for like managers, executive, management level, directors, CEO, etc. So this is actually the most preferred pass that entrepreneurs or foreigners who are starting their business in Singapore would apply for because there's no local headcounts or quotas that is required. So basically there is a minimum salary that is required to get the employment pass, which we have a point system that we will assess from the Ministry of Manpower. So this is based on the applicant's age, their educational qualifications, and their working experience. So for this pass is one of the most popular passes because it just need to have the minimal or qualifying criteria to be able to apply for. So for one pass, the main criteria of having this is that the applicant needs to earn equivalent to Singapore 30,000 per month for the past year. So for the one pass, what they are looking at is for people who are able to share their skills, knowledge, and to be able to provide mentorship in Singapore. So when we're applying for the one pass, there's a few criteria that we'll look at. Example is like contributions that you have made professionally over the last couple of years, and what can you potentially contribute to the workforce in Singapore for the next few years. So so the salary is the first criteria, then after which is the professional contributions. So these are the main passes basically in Singapore that most expats are applying for at the moment.
Certainly plenty of different options. I mean, I guess if I'm, and let's use Australia as an example, I'm sitting in Melbourne thinking, gee, the weather sucks. It'd be lovely to move to Singapore. How do I figure out, which pass, and then I guess what are the steps that are involved to actually apply, whether it be an employment pass or an S pass or a one pass? What do those steps look like?
Okay, so basically the pass application process is going to be very similar for any of the passes that you're applying for. So earlier we did mention about educational qualifications. So in Singapore, all the educational qualifications that you wish to declare for your application needs to be verified by a background screening company. So this is the first step. So if someone is thinking about applying for a work pass, this verification process could take maybe up to a month. So this would be the first step to take. Then after which it will be for agents like ourselves to go through the applicant's work experience and the minimal criteria. Once all the minimal criteria is met, then we will basically gather all the details to submit the application to the Ministry of Manpower. Then they will assess it and get back to us. Sometimes they could ask for some supporting documents. So especially for the employment pass, if someone is going to set up their own business, some documents may be requested, such as if you have any potential clients, if you have any contracts or agreements that is going to be in place, if there could be any letter of intent for collaboration, and also if the company have got sufficient funds. So as we mentioned earlier, it depends on the industry that you are in. So let's say if you're going to open a F&B business and you have only like $100 in your company account, then that's probably a no-no. So yeah, so these are some of the basic criteria that we are looking at. So once the criteria are met, then the application is very straightforward. The officers will review it and just let us know whether it's approved or not. Then we move on to the next step. Yeah.
I guess for those who perhaps have quite a broad skill set, perhaps, maybe they've worked in different industries, not quite sure what they want to do, but they want to become an expat, they want to move. Again, we use Australia as the example. They just want to get out of Australia, come to Singapore, enjoy the great lifestyle, pay a lot less tax. And yes, to your earlier point, the tax rate here is much more friendly than Australia, as most will know. Are there, I guess, industries, jobs, professions, maybe even ages that are more likely to, I guess, let's use an employment pass as an example. So maybe industries, jobs, ages where you're more likely to get that employment pass approved?
Yeah, so I did mention earlier that there is a point system that is given by the Ministry of Manpower when they are assessing the employment pass application. So there is something that is called the skill shortages industry. So for people who have qualifications, I think in Australia you have the same as well. So if you are in some of the niche industries, that it gives you a better opportunity to be able to be eligible for the employment pass. So some of the industries will be like agri-tech, financial services, green or renewable energy, healthcare, infocom, technology, and maritime. So these are part of the skills shortages industry. So if the applicant also have got abundant experience in these sectors, right, they can be eligible for a 5-year EP duration, which is much longer than a regular employment pass, which is 2 years.
Yeah, and you touched on employment pass as being, I suppose, the most common or the most likely that you'll see. But what role does the one pass really play in Singapore? And if an Australian was going to apply for a one pass, how would they go about that?
So for the one pass, basically, the benefits is that once it's being approved, it's for 5 years. So you don't have to keep renewing the pass. That is one of the benefits. The second benefit is that it gives you a better opportunity if you wish to apply for permanent residency later on. Yeah, so because if you are going to be in one of the higher income bracket, that also puts you in a better position overall. And also earlier we did mention about the professional contributions. If you are able to contribute more exponentially to the workforce in Singapore, then that is a good addition that we want to take in as a permanent resident. So basically during the one pass application, the applicant would need to demonstrate what they have contributed in the last couple of years in their industry. So it can be like how they have mentored or supervised their subordinates, if there's anyone that they could have helped to elevate better in their own careers or through mentorship in the last couple of years. They will be required to detail their professional plans in Singapore for the next 5 years. So example, if they have any plans to set up their own companies, if they have any plans for local employment within the companies that they are going to set up, if they could possibly sit on like the board of directors for any companies, and what basically professional contributions they intend to have. So based on this, then the Ministry of Manpower's officers will be able to assess if this individual will be a great addition to impart their skills and knowledge for the betterment of our workforce. So that's like generally in regards to the one pass. So one of the key benefits of the one pass as well is that the applicant or the pass holder can operate, work, or open multiple companies at the same time when they are holding this pass. So example, if you're on the EP or employment pass, it's tagged only to your employer. So you can only work for one company. You're not able to work for multiple companies, whereas the one pass allows you to have that freedom. Yeah.
And you've touched on a bit with the employment pass and the one pass being individual, where the Ministry of Manpower is assessing the individual's ability and what they'll bring to Singapore. But how does that work with people who have families? I know there's the dependent pass. So how does that align? If someone's got a job offer in Singapore or wants to move to Singapore and they've been approved, what happens to their spouse, their children? How do they bring them along as well?
So for employment pass holders, they are eligible to apply for dependent passes, or what we call DPs, for their spouse and children, as long as they earn a minimum salary of above 6,000. So this is very easily met because for employment pass applications, the most minimal salary is 5,600 anyways. So yeah, to hit 6K is very easy, that you can bring your children over. And your spouse as well. So there's one thing I want to touch on, is that I think a lot of countries, they don't really get married officially these days. They just have a common spouse-in-law certificate. So that's the new trend these days. So for common spouse-in-law, they are not eligible for DPs, but there's something called long-term visit pass, which is the long-term visit LTVP, that they can apply for their common spouse. So due to them not having an official marriage certificate, the salary would be higher for the LTVP. So for employment pass holder to apply for their common spouse-in-law, it will be 12,000 and above for them to bring their long-term official partner over to Singapore. So for the spouse who comes to Singapore, they can choose to stay with their spouse, be a homemaker, or to do other things here. There's something that is also called the letter of consent, LOC, which allows dependents of the employment pass holder to operate their own business. So let's say if an employment pass holder's wife have been doing some arts and craft or doing some home baking or something, so they can open a small business in Singapore, and they are able to apply for this letter of consent, and they can still work in Singapore as well. So this is one of the benefits. So in regards to one pass comparison for their dependent passes, they do not need to fulfill this business owner criteria or open a business criteria. So they can look for any jobs in Singapore, and they will be able to apply for a letter of consent to work. So this is one of the better benefits of having a one pass. Yeah.
Certainly. Certainly lots to think about. I know there were some changes a number of years ago around dependent pass holders, letters of consent, rights to work. So I think the one pass for those who might be considering a move to Singapore, definitely an important one if your husband, wife, or long-term partner, I guess, is not going to work, or they're going to give up a business or give up a job. Definitely worth exploring. Zoe, I feel like we've thrown an awful lot of questions to you, so we'll shift gears a little bit and let's talk about permanent residency. Something that sort of gets floated around, particularly when we're talking about maybe buying property. But Canns, maybe you can just share with us some of the main advantages and perhaps the pitfalls of applying for PR in Singapore.
Well, there are many advantages when you apply for PR in Singapore. Once you've gotten your PR, you've opened up opportunities. Loads of opportunities for jobs, because there's certain jobs over here. Actually, majority of the advertisements that you see nowadays, they are looking for Singaporeans of PR. So definitely more job opportunities. And you also have the flexibility to switch jobs in between without the new application for work visas. So apart from jobs, we also have subsidies for healthcare. So for PR, for example, you get MediSave, CPF scheme. You will get to enjoy all these schemes, and the medical care is heavily subsidized when you are Singapore PR. There are a lot of my clients, they talk to me about not being able to get into local school because they are foreigners. So for foreigners, yes, unfortunately, if you are an EP holder, it will be harder for you to get into your preferred choice of local schools. So typically, EP holders are being allocated. However, for PR, there is a higher chance for you to get into your preferred local school later on. And as a PR, you can, when you have CPF contribution, you can use that fund to also purchase a HDB later on. And as you know, HDB is also heavily subsidized in Singapore, and without paying ABSD on the first property. So, stamp duty is significantly lower as compared to foreigners buying here. What else have we got? I think it's quite a lot of perks if you were to consider applying for PR. later on. And of course, you do get the ease of traveling in and out of Singapore later on with a re-entry permit without having to apply for visas all over again. If you have one of those passports that requires you a visa run from time to time.
Certainly plenty to consider. I mean, you touched on a few interesting points there. I guess one, school fees. Let's just, tackle that one for a second because, hey, with a little one at home, it's certainly front of mind for me, but also front of mind for a lot of clients. I think, if we look at your typical international school from, say, age 5, let's call it, you're probably looking at 30 to 45,000. I mean, that's some pretty expensive finger painting. Makes your eyes water. And yes, for anyone who's not aware, the Sing dollar is stronger than the Aussie dollar, so about an extra 10, or about 13% in today's money. But I guess what would local school look like by way of comparison in terms of those sort of annual fees for a permanent resident here?
So for local schools, if you're an EP holder, it is you have to pay international fees. I think it ranges from about 1,000 to 1,005 per month. And you'll have to pay 12 months a year. Unfortunately, it's not being structured, in semesters like international school. For example, the international schools, we probably pay about 3 terms. And for local schools, if you're PR, it costs only about $20 a month for school fees.
$20. Well, that's a far cry from 40,000.
Yeah.
Certainly a lot to think about. And I think probably, worth acknowledging there, you touched on if an EP holder goes to that local school, it might be 1,000 to 1,500. But probably also worth noting that it may also be very unlikely they would get in because obviously it's sort of preferential access to those schools for citizens, then PRs, then the rest. So, while some might be thinking, oh, you beauty, take my kid out of XYZ international school, we'll put them down the road in the local one and we'll save all this money. It may not be quite that easy. Before I throw back over to Will, just one other point you raised there. So many acronyms when it comes to housing. ABSD. Maybe you could just, we don't need to go into the exact percentages, but what is it? And I guess why does it differ between PR and foreigners?
So for ABSC, as far as I remember now, it's about 60% for an EP holder, which is completely eye-watering. And they are not, and of course, you're not allowed to buy HDB either. So your choices are very limited, and you won't be able to access the HDB. So for HDB, for your first-time buyer, you do not have the ABSD to pay for. And of course, you can also tap on grants as well for first-time buyer, for first-time HDB buyer.
And just for everyone listening, ABSD is additional buyer's stamp duty. So there is buyer's stamp duty and additional buyer's stamp duty. So just in case it was unclear whether Singapore was trying to encourage foreigners to come in and buy these properties, having ramped up that rate from 20 to 25 to 30 to now 60%. And if you try and be clever and seek advice from qualified financial advisors and wrap it in a trust or wrap it in another structure, that'll go up to 65. So message received, Singapore. Foreigners, probably consider buying elsewhere. Will, I'll throw back to you. We've dived into Singapore property enough.
Well, I think what I've just gathered from all of that is, either have PR, don't have kids in Singapore might be the other option. It sounds like a very expensive venture. Maybe wait until you're back in Australia or definitely plan it. But look, if we were talking about, getting PRs, let's say you're an Australian expat, you're living in Singapore, you're on an employment pass, how would you transit into permanent residency? How would you apply for that? What would that look like?
Okay, so for the application process for work passes, focuses more on education and working experiences for the applicant on professional level. For the PR application is quite different. So what we do is, a lot of time we would sit down with our clients to understand, their profile and the background. It's all about the time that you spend in Singapore, how you've integrated into society.
So are there any main, I suppose, disadvantages? I mean, we've talked a lot about the benefits of PR, But is there anything that's, maybe a disadvantage or anything that people should really be thinking about before they apply for a PR? Bringing things front of mind just to make sure they know all the pros and cons.
So for PR applications, right, actually one of the main things that we would also like to highlight is that before considering applying for it is your commitment to stay long-term in Singapore. Because some people, they are like, I want to have a PR status, but I still want to stay in Australia, then why are you applying for this, right? So it's like you want to make sure that you want to be able to stay long-term in Singapore or see this as a place to maybe like set roots or build a family here or something like this. So for PRs, they have something which is called a re-entry permit that they can enter and exit Singapore without applying for separate visas each time. So this is kind of valid for 5 years. So upon the 5 years, you will need to renew it again. So if out of these 5 years, let's say like 4 years you're in Australia, only 1 year you're in Singapore, then it doesn't really make sense for you to be holding the PR status. So before applying for PR, you also want to keep in mind that if you do get awarded PR and for some reason, for example, if you're not able to be staying in Singapore and your PR status gets revoked, then you might have issues like coming back to Singapore for work or to apply for PR or maybe get married to to get a long-term pass to stay long-term here in Singapore if you get married to someone here. So these are also, some of the pitfalls before applying for the PR status.
And from the Australian side of things, and this might be a bit of a hearsay question, but do you feel like the Singapore government sees Australians in a positive light when it comes to benefiting the local economy, the community, society? If Australians are thinking about moving to Singapore, do you feel like the Singapore government is very accepting, of Australians making that move?
Generally, Singapore is a very multicultural and multiracial country, so I wouldn't say that we have any preference of any nationalities. It's like as long as you're able to contribute here, beneficially, then of course the government will welcome you here. Yeah.
Maybe we can get a little soundbite of that one and shoot it over to them, and hopefully they'll follow along with the podcast. I guess just a couple of things. One thing you raised there, permanent residency, time in Singapore. I guess just while we're talking about this, one question, Will, myself, we get time and time again is, if I get permanent residency, can I then just move back to Australia but only pay tax in Singapore? The answer is no. PR is not tax residency. So let's just clear that one up while we're on the topic. But back to our questions. I guess thinking through, timeframes, we've, I've met many people over the years who've applied for PR multiple times. But I guess across the board, whether you're applying for an S pass or an employment pass or a one pass or permanent residency, what are some of the timeframes that you're seeing at the moment in terms of those processing times?
Okay, so in terms of permanent residency itself, right, the application process, before we even apply for it, so earlier we also did ask the questions about what to prepare for, right, before you apply for a PR. So it doesn't, so technically you can submit an application after being in Singapore for 6 months, but we would not recommend doing it so quickly because you need time to really integrate into the society, to have a feel about life in Singapore, whether you want to make this commitment to stay here long term. And 6 months is too short of a time to figure that out, so to speak. So we would generally recommend that after like 1.5 to 2 years, after you have lived life here, have a feel, okay, like if you feel that Singapore is a great place to be, you want to be here further, then we can start that process. So there are a few things that we will also look at is like in terms of contributions back to Singapore, not just professionally, which we mentioned so many times in the work passes segment. In terms of permanent residency as a part of integration, we also need to look at some society contributions, like how is the individual a good addition to Singapore. Is like if the person has been volunteering in their free time, that shows like, wow, it's wonderful, this individual wants to give back to our society. So some of the clients, the things that they have considered, so we actually do have an Australian client who had applied for permanent residency. He was tutoring underprivileged children. So this is a great cause that he was doing. So because he knows these kids, they could not afford to get a tutor. So whenever he finishes work, he sees them in the evenings. He helps them to give them the additional push to their education. So certain contributions or things like this are great to to show your genuine intention to be able to help in Singapore. So these are some of the things to be looking at. Then also timeline. So these things that we are doing or integrating or setting up the life in Singapore is going to take about 1.5 to 2 years. Then when we do submit the application, so the technical aspects is going to take you at least 6 months to hear back from the immigrations authority on whether your application has been approved or not. Then if it has been approved, great. But if it has not been approved, then there is the opportunity to appeal for it or to reapply for the application. So in certain situations, if the application is being seriously considered, it could take about 12 months to 18 months to hear back. So it doesn't mean that in 6 months you will definitely get an outcome. So we have clients who have waited up to 22 months before they have gotten an outcome from the immigration authorities. So I would say that the whole application process, in some situations, it could take 4 years to 5 years to be able to prepare for the permanent residency application, to hear back, etc. Yeah.
Okay, that certainly makes sense. And I mean, I guess, we've spoken a lot about families and working, setting up business. What if I just want to move to Singapore to retire here? Or what if I'm already living here? Let's say I'm on an employment pass or I'm on PR. So I'm a permanent resident here. What rights do I have, or how do I even think about, or isn't it even an option to actually retire here in Singapore as a foreigner?
So in Singapore, there's no retirement visas. So that's the first thing. So if someone is looking at retiring here, we would recommend to at least try to secure a PR status. Yeah. So we have some of our clients that we know they have been here like 30 years and they still didn't apply for PR. And we're like, why? It's like, don't you want to retire here after so long? So it's like, okay, so basically for PR, there is something called the CPF, which is in short, is Central Provision Fund. So this is kind of like a pension scheme. So for PRs, when you're working in Singapore, each month, 20% of your income will have to go into this pension fund, and your employer would need to contribute 17% of your income to this pension fund as well. So you get 37% a month that is saved into this fund. So when you reach the age of 55 and 65, so there's like two different age groups that you can draw the money out. So 65, you get a sum that you can use for retirement. Then when you reach 65, you get also a monthly payout. So that helps you to retire in Singapore. So this is one of the schemes that they have. Yeah, so there's no actual retirement visa, but PR and having this pension scheme will help you to retire in Singapore.
Fantastic. I guess maybe one final question we'll throw over to both of you. I guess, what is the sort of outlook, I guess, for Australian expats in Singapore? Do you see opportunities getting greater? Do you see it getting tougher? What is the crystal ball telling you?
Tougher as in like in job opportunities, or?
Yeah, perhaps job opportunities, cost of living, just for Australians moving here in general, I guess, in whatever way you want to take that, based on the conversations you're having.
Yeah, I will also actually say that costs are rising everywhere. So even in like Sydney downtown, if you were to rent an apartment, I guess a 1 bedroom will cost you like more than 3,000, right? So that's also quite similar to Singapore if you are living in a good area. But let's say if you are comfortable with renting a government subsidized flat, which is available for expats in Singapore, that can also bring your costs down a lot. So if I were to rent a 1 bedroom apartment in the government flat, which is the HDB, I can rent a room for only 1,400. So that is quite comfortable. And in our neighborhood areas, you get a lot of like facilities such as like swimming pool, park connectors. You can go take a walk in the parks that's available. The government has done a great job. You can easily like cycle everywhere. So I think these are some of the things that I would compare to, as in I think general cost of living, it would be lower than in Australia if someone were to come here for long term. Yeah, in terms of job opportunities, it's open to all, being a being a multinational platform. Yeah, so there's no specific nationalities that we are looking at as long as the person is able to perform the work. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, look, ladies, really appreciate your time today. I think we've unpacked a lot. We've dived into PR. We've dived into the One Pass, S Pass, employment passes, ABSD. Yes, don't have children here. Don't send them to school here. Don't buy property here unless you're PR. Joking, of course, seek advice. But some, really, I guess, powerful messages there and some really great insights for our audience. On behalf of Will, myself, and of course our wider community, a huge thank you to you both for giving us your time today.
Awesome interview there with Zoe and Canns. As Jarrad touched on before the interview, there was so much to unpack. I think we got through a lot of it. Employment passes, S Pass, One Pass, permanent residency, kids and schooling. There's lots and lots of things to consider there. And now, guys, as always, we are releasing an episode of this podcast on the last Wednesday of every single month. We will be talking about topics from immigration, as we just did, to investing overseas, to buying property as an expat, to coming back to Australia, getting your will or estate planning sorted. You name it, we'll be talking about it. The podcast is available on all major hosting services. So Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you listen to your podcasts, you should be able to find us. And just a final note for me as well, too, we always want to hear your ideas. If you're an avid listener of our podcast, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear anything you want us to cover or experts you want us to have on, any topics like that. We record this podcast for you, for the listener. So if you guys have ideas or you have thoughts or you have something you want us to cover off, just reach out and let us know.
Fantastic. Thanks, Will. And yes, obviously, if you would like to leave us a review, so we'd be very grateful. 5 stars, please. Always delighted to hear from our listeners. Hopefully everyone's getting a lot of value out of this. Obviously, we're not here to sell anything. So if you are getting value, let someone know if you think they'd also benefit from listening to us each month. So we are really aiming to provide valuable content, valuable information, but also dispelling some of the common myths that we see far too often in this world of personal finance. Obviously, if this is of interest, be sure to follow us on social media as well. We are across pretty well all channels, LinkedIn, Facebook. Obviously, the podcasts are going up on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts as well as all of the others. But do check us out on the social channels where we are providing some other regular updates as well. It'll also mean you won't miss any of the episodes. The final episode of the calendar year will be coming out late December. So that'll be episode 12 for the year. And then, of course, we'll be straight back into it in 2025, which sounds a little bit scary that we're already making Christmas plans and talking about the new year. But there you have it. But on behalf of Will and I and our team, thank you very much for giving us your time. Thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Till next time, guys.